The vox horns screamed our names for the 4th time that morning, each syllable stripped of honorifics, each surname barked like an accusation. Dreyer, Nathan, Sergeant, formally. The word formally echoed through the hold of the transport ship Penitent Virtue, bouncing off rust-streaked bulkheads and the faces of men I had served beside for 9 years. Someone was weeping 3 rows behind me. Someone else kept coughing, the wet rattle of lungs that had inhaled too much promethium smoke on Calendros 4, normal sounds, battlefield sounds. But here, in the processing hold, shackled wrist to ankle, those sounds meant something different. Here, they marked us. 1,143 soldiers remained of the Veridon 77th Rifles. 1,143 men and women who had held the Mordecai Gap for 16 days against greenskin assault. 1,143 souls who had marched through the acid swamps of Tertius Minor without complaint, who had garrisoned the frozen batteries of Station Kresh, who had bled and killed and followed orders for 12 years of unbroken service. Now we sat in chains while a junior scribe read from a data slate cataloguing our sins. Dreyer, Nathan, Sergeant, Platoon Command of Rifle Platoon 3, 2nd Company, charged under Article 17 of the Lex Imperialis with conspiracy to commit treason, charged under Article 42 with failure to report seditious communications, charged under Article 91 with association with declared enemies of the Imperium. I did not respond. What could I say? That I had never conspired with anyone, that the only communications I had ever failed to report were the grumblings of hungry soldiers and the complaints of men who wanted to go home, that the only enemy I had ever associated with was the enemy I killed. The scribe waited for a moment, stylus poised over the data slate, then made a small notation and moved on to the next name. Corporal Marcus Hendricks was not in our hold. Corporal Marcus Hendricks was not in chains. Corporal Marcus Hendricks was, according to the charges read against us, already dead, executed by firing squad on Veridon Tertius 4 days ago, immediately upon discovery of his crimes. The rest of us, the 1,143 who had served alongside him, who had eaten the same ration packs and stood the same watches and never once suspected that among us walked a man whose encoded transmissions had reached ears beyond the Emperor's light, we were still being processed. The transport ship groaned around us, ancient metal flexing as we translated through the warp. I had made this journey before, though never in chains. The Penitent Virtue was a prison transport, her holds converted decades ago to carry the guilty and the condemned. The air recyclers wheezed with neglect, pushing out atmosphere that tasted of rust and desperation. Someone had scratched words into the bulkhead beside my head, deep gouges in the metal the Emperor sees. I wondered if the man who carved it had believed those words, or if he had meant them as accusation. Lieutenant Joanna Pierce sat across from me, her wrists raw where the shackles had rubbed the skin bloody. She had been my commanding officer for 3 years, a woman whose tactical sense had saved my platoon on Calendros when the greenskins breached the east wall. Now her eyes were empty, staring at nothing, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps silent denial. Or perhaps she was simply counting the hours until this ended. They will review the evidence. Private First Class Damon T kept saying. He was young, barely 20 standard years, and he had believed everything the Munitorum had ever told him. There will be a tribunal. They have to give us a tribunal. No one answered him. We had all seen tribunals. We knew what they were for. The evidence against us was precise, comprehensive, and damning. Corporal Hendricks had maintained a hidden Vox unit in his kit for approximately 7 months, transmitting encoded messages to parties unknown during rest periods and guard rotations. The messages, once decoded by Mechanicus adepts, contained detailed information about regimental movements, supply schedules, defensive positions, and command structures. Over 37 separate transmissions had been logged. During that same 7-month period, the Veridon 77th had suffered 4 ambushes that had cost us nearly 300 soldiers. Those ambushes had been blamed on poor intelligence, on the enemy's unexpected tactical flexibility, on the fortunes of war. We had mourned our dead and continued the campaign. We had followed orders, we had done our duty, And all that time Corporal Marcus Hendricks had been feeding our positions to the enemy. I kept trying to remember his face. Brown hair, I thought, or perhaps dark blonde, average height. A quiet man who kept to himself, competent with a lasgun but nothing exceptional. He had served in 1st Platoon under Sergeant Corrigan, and I had spoken to him perhaps 3 times in 5 years. Nothing memorable, nothing suspicious, nothing at all. That was the horror of it. A man could walk among you for years, could share your dangers and your hardships and your small victories, and you would never know what lived behind his eyes. You would never know that every time you gathered around the map table, every time you discussed tomorrow's advance, every time you complained about supply shortages or praised the courage of your soldiers, he was listening. Recording, transmitting. The Voxhorn crackled again, and the scribe's voice continued its endless litany of names and charges. 3 rows behind me, Private Teague kept talking. The Commissar will speak for us. Commissar Brennan knows our record. He knows what we did on Kalendros. He knows. Brennan is the one who turned us in. The voice belonged to Sergeant Wallace Corrigan, the man who had commanded Hendricks directly. Corrigan had not spoken since we boarded the transport. His face was a mask of bruises. The Commissar's men had questioned him extensively before our departure, and his words came slow and thick through swollen lips. Brennan found the Vox unit. Brennan decoded the messages. Brennan is the one who declared us all guilty by association. Corrigan turned his head and spat blood onto the deck. Brennan is going to be promoted for this, breaking a traitor cell, uncovering sedition in the ranks. He will be a hero. Lieutenant Pierce's lips stopped moving. She looked up, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes, anger perhaps, or the last flicker of defiance before acceptance claimed her. Corrigan, she said, how did Hendricks hide a Vox unit in your platoon for 7 months? The question hung in the recycled air. Around us, other soldiers turned to listen, chains clinking softly with the movement. Corrigan's ruined face twisted into something that might have been a smile. That is the question, Lieutenant. That is the very question. How did a corporal maintain unauthorized equipment through 7 months of kit inspections? How did he transmit messages during guard rotations without anyone hearing the Vox traffic? How did he access encoded channels that should have been locked to Munitorum cipher keys? You are suggesting he had help. I am suggesting nothing. Corrigan leaned back against the bulkhead, chains rattling. I am merely observing that certain questions remain unanswered. But we are traitors now, Lieutenant. Traitors do not get to ask questions. The transport shuddered as something vast passed nearby in the warp, the Geller field flickering imperceptibly. Several soldiers made the sign of the Aquila with shackled hands. I found myself doing the same, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. We were still servants of the Imperium. We still believed. That was the cruelest part. Days passed in the hold. Time became measured not by hours but by the rhythm of processing. Name after name read over the Voxhorn, notation after notation made in data slates, evidence after evidence catalogued and filed. We were fed twice daily, thin nutrient paste pushed through the bars of our enclosure by servitors whose dead eyes reflected nothing. We slept on the metal floor, chains too short to allow anything but curled positions. We spoke in whispers when we spoke at all. I found myself watching my fellow soldiers with new eyes, not suspicious eyes. I was beyond suspicion now, but observing, cataloguing, trying to understand how we had come to this. The 77th had been a good regiment, not exceptional perhaps, but solid, reliable. We had held when told to hold and advanced when ordered to advance. Our casualty rates were average for a frontline infantry unit. Our discipline was adequate. We had won no great victories, but we had suffered no catastrophic defeats. We were, in every way, precisely what the Munitorum expected from a standard line regiment. And now we were traitors, all of us, because of one man. Private Teague stopped talking about tribunals on the 3rd day. Lieutenant Pierce stopped praying on the 4th. Sergeant Corrigan simply sat against the bulkhead, watching the servitors come and go, his bruised face unreadable. I thought about Hendricks. I tried to construct a narrative that made sense. Had he been a traitor from the beginning, planted in our ranks by some enemy cult or Xenos intelligence? Had something happened during our campaign that had turned him against the Imperium? Had he been blackmailed, coerced, threatened, or had he simply decided, somewhere in the grinding misery of endless war, that the enemy offered something the Emperor could not? The questions circled in my mind like carrion birds, never landing, never resolving. I did not know. I could not know. Hendrix was dead, and whatever secrets he had carried had died with him. But Corrigan's words kept returning to me. How did a corporal maintain unauthorized equipment through 7 months of kit inspections? On the 5th day, they came for Corrigan. 2 guards entered the hold, their uniforms marking them as naval security rather than guard. They unlocked Corrigan's shackles from the deck ring and hauled him to his feet without ceremony. He did not resist. There was nowhere to resist to, but as they dragged him toward the hatch, he looked back at Lieutenant Pierce. "The requisition forms," he said. "Check the requisition forms for 7th month. Someone signed for equipment that was never issued." Then he was gone, the hatch clanging shut behind him, and we did not see him again. Lieutenant Pierce sat very still for a long time after that. Then she looked at me. "Dreyer, in 7th month you were acting platoon quartermaster for 2nd Company. Captain Vane was rotating the duty roster." I remembered. A week of tedious paperwork while the regiment garrisoned a transit station between deployments. Requisition forms, inventory lists, supply manifests. I had signed dozens of documents, hundreds perhaps, each one stamped with the Aquila and filed in the eternal archives of the Munitorum. "I signed what was put in front of me," I said. "Whatever needed signing. Do you remember signing for communications equipment? A Vox unit, perhaps? Anything that might have been diverted?" The hold felt suddenly colder. I searched my memory, trying to pull specific forms from the blur of bureaucratic routine, but there was nothing. Just paperwork, just signatures, just the endless grind of documentation that kept the Imperial war machine functioning. "I do not remember," I admitted. "There was so much, I cannot remember every form." Pierce nodded slowly. Her eyes had sharpened, some of the emptiness replaced by something harder. Then perhaps someone counted on that. Perhaps someone knew that a quartermaster rotating through temporary duty would sign without reading, would approve without questioning. "You are saying I was used." "I am saying we were all used, Sergeant. The question is, by whom?" The transport continued its journey through the warp. We were not told our destination, but rumor spread through the hold like infection. Penal colony, mining world, servitor conversion facility. Each possibility worse than the last, each one spoken in whispers by soldiers who had spent their lives facing death bravely and now discovered that some fates were worse than battle. But Pierce's words had planted something in my mind. A suspicion without form, a question without answer. If Hendrix had been enabled by diverted supplies, by signed requisitions, by documentation that created plausible deniability, then someone had planned this. Someone had known that a corporal could not operate alone, that equipment needed to come from somewhere, that records needed to be falsified, and that someone was almost certainly still walking free while we rotted in chains. On the 7th day, Captain Ellis Vane was brought into our hold. I had not seen our regimental commander since before the arrests. He had been separated from us immediately, held in different facilities, questioned by different inquisitors. The man who entered now was barely recognizable. His uniform had been stripped, replaced by prisoner's greys. His face bore the marks of extensive interrogation. But his eyes were what struck me. They darted constantly, never settling, filled with a fear that I had never seen in him before. Captain Vane had led us through 3 campaigns. He had stood in the breach on Calendros when the greenskins poured through, rallying the line with nothing but a bolt pistol and his voice. He had made the hard decisions, which units to sacrifice, which ground to cede, which soldiers to spend, and he had made them without flinching. I had respected him. We all had. The guards shackled him to a deck ring near the center of the hold, where everyone could see him. That was not accidental. "Captain, Lieutenant." Pierce's voice was carefully neutral. "We were told you would be tried separately." Vane laughed. The sound was hollow, wrong. "Tried, yes, They tried me, Lieutenant. 3 days of questions, 3 days of evidence, 3 days of—" He trailed off, looking at his hands. They were trembling. I told them what they wanted to hear. I had no choice. You understand that, do you not? They gave me no choice. The hold went silent. Even the constant coughing from the back rows stopped. What did you tell them? Pierce asked. Vane shook his head, still staring at his hands. They had evidence, documents, signed orders, equipment transfers that I could not explain. They showed me how the conspiracy worked, how Hendricks was just the transmitter, not the organizer. They showed me that someone in command had to be involved. Someone had to have enabled the operation. Someone had to have looked the other way. And what did you tell them? Pierce's voice had hardened. I told them it was true. Vane finally looked up, meeting her eyes. His own were wet, though whether with tears or terror I could not say. I told them that senior officers in the 77th had knowingly enabled Hendricks' transmissions. I told them that the conspiracy reached the highest levels of regimental command. I confirmed their evidence. I gave them what they needed. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the rows of chained soldiers, someone spat. "You lying coward!" The voice was Corrigan's. I recognized it even before I saw him pushed forward by the same guards who had taken him days ago. He was in worse condition now, barely able to stand, his face a ruin of fresh bruises layered over old. But his voice still carried. There was no conspiracy, Corrigan said. There was one traitor and a system that let him operate. You are giving them excuses, Captain. You are letting them turn incompetence into sedition. They would have killed me. Vane's voice cracked. You do not understand. They would have killed me and called it justice. This way there is a chance, a tribunal, evidence that can be examined, time to condemn us all. Lieutenant Pierce spoke quietly, but her words silenced Vane. You have testified that the regiment's command structure was complicit. That means every officer is guilty by your own confession. That means there will be no tribunal, there will be no examination of evidence. There will only be sentences. Vane's face crumbled. Whatever calculus he had made in the interrogation chamber, whatever desperate bargain he had struck with his captors, he was realizing now that the terms were not what he had thought. He had sacrificed his soldiers to save himself, and in doing so, he had ensured that none of us would be saved. The guards shackled Corrigan next to Vane, close enough that the two men could see each other clearly, close enough that Vane would have to look at what his testimony had brought. The requisition forms, Corrigan said. I asked about them before. Did anyone look? Pierce nodded. Dreyer was acting quartermaster in 7th month. Someone could have slipped documents through his desk, had them signed without scrutiny. Not could have, did. Corrigan's voice was fading, his injuries taking their toll. I thought about it, after they took me. I had nothing to do but think. Hendrix's equipment came from somewhere. The cipher keys came from somewhere. Those are not things a corporal can acquire on his own. Someone in the logistics chain was feeding him. Someone in our regiment, someone with access to Munitorum systems, someone who could forge requisitions and bury the records. Corrigan coughed, wet and thick. Commissar Brennan has been with us for 18 months. Before that he served on Veridon Tertius. Before that his records are sealed. The implication hung in the air, but even as I grasped its significance, I understood that it meant nothing. We were already condemned. Whatever conspiracy had destroyed the 77th, whatever hidden hands had enabled Hendricks and framed the rest of us, it did not matter. We were traitors now. The evidence said so. The captain had confirmed it, and the Imperium did not revisit its judgments. The transport emerged from the warp on the 9th day. Through the small viewport in the hold's upper wall, I could see a grey world spinning slowly, its surface scarred with strip mines and industrial complexes. A world where resources were extracted without thought for beauty or balance. A world where human lives were just another material to be processed. We had arrived. The processing began immediately. Guards entered the hold in waves, unlocking shackles, separating soldiers into groups. Officers to the left, enlisted to the right, those with specialized skills, Medicaid training, technical expertise, combat distinction, pulled aside for different processing. I watched as the regiment I had served with for 12 years was dismantled, sorted, catalogued for disposal. Lieutenant Pierce was taken to the officer processing line. She met my eyes as the guards led her away, and she nodded once, a gesture that might have meant goodbye or might have meant something else entirely. Then she was gone. Private Teague, still young enough to be valuable, was pulled into the specialized skills group despite having nothing special about him except his youth. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps they needed bodies that could still move quickly. I was pushed toward the general enlisted line with several hundred others, men and women whose only crime was wearing the same uniform as Corporal Marcus Hendricks. We shuffled forward in chains, moving toward a processing station where Munitorum scribes waited with data slates and brand irons. The brand came first. A servitor held my arm steady, while a tech adept pressed the iron to my inner wrist. The pain was sharp, clarifying, and when the iron was removed, I could see the mark clearly, a stylized skull over crossed bones, the symbol of the penal legions. I was no longer Sergeant Nathan Dreyer of the Veridon 77th Rifles. I was now Penitent Legionnaire, 774 Sigma 91, assigned to the Redemption Battalion, seconded to punitive operations in the Kalos Reach. The scribe who processed my documentation paused when she reached my service record. 9 years in the 77th, 4 campaign ribbons, commendation for actions on Calendros 4th. She looked up at me with eyes that held neither sympathy nor cruelty, only the blank efficiency of someone who processed thousands of faces each month. You had a promising career, Legionnaire. I said nothing. What was there to say? Your new commanding officer is Commissar Leggett Brennan. The scribe made a notation on her data slate. He specifically requested soldiers from the 77th for his battalion. Something about understanding the enemy. The name hit me like a blow. Brennan. The same Brennan who had discovered Hendricks. The same Brennan whose sealed records Corrigan had mentioned. The same Brennan who was being promoted for breaking a traitor cell that might never have existed. I see you recognize the name. The scribe's voice was flat, uninterested. Good. The Commissar Legate values soldiers who pay attention. She stamped my documentation and handed me a kit bag containing my new uniform, grey fatigue stripped of all insignia, penal legion markings stenciled on the shoulders, a collar inscribed with explosive runes that would detonate if I strayed beyond the permitted operational area. Standard equipment for the damned. I was herded with the other processed soldiers toward a mustering yard where transports waited to take us to our new assignments. The sky above was grey and thick with industrial haze. The ground beneath our feet was stained with chemicals that would never wash away. And standing on a raised platform at the center of the yard, watching us assemble with the satisfied expression of a man whose plans had come together perfectly, was Commissar Brennan. He was younger than I had expected, mid-30s at most, with a thin face and eyes that never quite settled on anything for more than a moment. He wore his new rank with casual arrogance, the Commissar Legate's insignia gleaming on his collar. When he spoke, his voice was amplified by a voxcaster, echoing across the yard with perfect clarity. Former soldiers of the Veridon 77th, you stand here because you failed in your most basic duty, loyalty to the Imperium. You served alongside a traitor, ate with a traitor, fought beside a traitor, and you never noticed, you never reported, you never acted. He paused, letting the words sink in, but the Emperor, in his infinite mercy, offers redemption even to the fallen. You will serve in the Redemption Battalion, assigned to operations in the Kalos Reach. There, you will have the opportunity to prove your worth. You will hunt the same enemies that Corporal Hendricks served. You will destroy the cells that received his transmissions. You will, in short, clean up the mess that your failure created. Around me, soldiers stood in perfect stillness. The explosive collars hummed softly against our throats. I know some of you believe yourselves innocent. Brennan's thin lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. I know some of you have constructed elaborate theories about conspiracies and frame-ups. I know some of you think that if you could just explain, just present the right evidence, you would be vindicated. He spread his hands. You are wrong. You are guilty because the Imperium has declared you guilty. You are traitors because the evidence proves you traitors. and no amount of protest will change that." He lowered his hands. "But your service in the Redemption Battalion can. Fight well, die well, and perhaps, your names will be restored. Your families will receive your death benefits. Your memory will not carry the stain of sedition." It was a lie, of course, penal. Legions did not earn redemption. Penal legions earned death, usually within their first deployment, usually in operations too dangerous or too costly for regular units. We were expendable now, ammunition for missions that regular troops would refuse. But as I stood there in my grey fatigues with the brand on my wrist and the collar around my throat, I found myself thinking not about death but about Brennan, about his sealed records, about his convenient discovery of Hendricks' equipment, about his new rank and his new battalion, and the way he spoke of the Kalos Reach as if he knew it intimately. Someone had enabled Hendricks. Someone had created the documentation trail that condemned the 77th. Someone had orchestrated the destruction of an entire regiment, and that someone was now standing on a platform in front of us, wearing a Commissar legate's insignia and speaking of redemption. I could not prove it. I would never be able to prove it. The evidence that might have exonerated us was buried in Munitorum archives, classified or destroyed. The witnesses who might have testified, Corrigan, Pierce, others who had seen the inconsistencies, were scattered across penal battalions or already dead. The truth, whatever it was, would remain hidden, but I would be serving under Brennan now. I would be watching him. And in the hell of the Kalos Reach, amid the chaos of punitive operations against enemies whose communications had somehow reached a corporal in the 77th, perhaps I would find an opportunity that the processing holds and the tribunals had never offered. The transports began loading. Soldiers shuffled forward in their grey fatigues, branded and collared and broken, climbing into the belly of ships that would carry them to their deaths. I moved with them, just another body in the tide, just another number in the Munitorum's endless accounting. But I watched Brennan as I boarded, and just for a moment, as the transport's ramp began to close, our eyes met. He smiled. I did not smile back, but I filed his face away in my memory, in the place where I kept the faces of enemies who had not yet died. Hendricks might have been the traitor, but Hendricks had been a tool. The hand that wielded him was still walking free, was still wearing the Emperor's uniform, was still being rewarded for treachery. The ramp sealed, the transport's engines roared to life, and the former Veridon's 77th Rifles, now Redemption Battalion, now penal fodder, now the Emperor's condemned, began the journey to the Kalos Reach. I did not know what I would find there. I did not know if I would survive long enough to find anything at all. But I knew this: the regiment had been destroyed by one man's treason, and that treason had been enabled by another man's ambition. And as long as I drew breath, I would not forget. The transport lifted off, leaving the grey world behind. Through the tiny viewport, I watched it shrink until it was just another point of light among the stars. Somewhere in those stars, Commissar Legate Brennan's contacts were waiting. Somewhere in that darkness, the recipients of Hendricks' transmissions were preparing for our arrival. They would know we were coming. They would know our strength, our deployment patterns, our operational parameters. They would know because someone would tell them, and I would be watching when they did. The Kalos Reach was a war zone 17 systems wide, a bleeding wound in the Imperium's eastern fringe where insurgent cells and Xenos raiders struck at supply lines and isolated garrisons. For 6 months before our arrival, Brennan had commanded operations against these enemies, his sealed records hiding whatever contacts he had made and whatever bargains he had struck. Now he would command us, the survivors of a regiment he had destroyed, sending us into the very territory where his allies waited. The symmetry was almost elegant. We would die fighting enemies who had our intelligence. We would fall in battles that were rigged from the start. And each death would be another testament to Brennan's effectiveness, another reason for his superiors to trust him, another step in whatever ascent he had planned. Unless someone stopped him. The other soldiers in the transport sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Some prayed, some wept. Some simply stared at the metal walls with the blank expressions of men who had already accepted their deaths. They did not know what I suspected. They could not know. Any whisper of conspiracy, any suggestion that our Commissar Legate was himself compromised, would be met with execution. The Imperium did not tolerate doubt in its officials, but doubt was all I had left. Doubt, and the memory of Corrigan's words about sealed records and convenient discoveries. Doubt, and the knowledge that requisition forms bearing my signature had somehow enabled Hendrix's operation. Doubt, and the cold certainty that guilty men did not smile the way Brennan had smiled. The transport hummed through the void. Hours passed. I dozed and woke and dozed again, my dreams filled with the faces of dead soldiers and the sound of Vox traffic I had never heard. Somewhere in those dreams, Hendrix was speaking, but I could never quite make out the words. They were encoded, encrypted, hidden behind layers of cipher that only Brennan could unlock. When I woke for the final time, the transport was descending toward a blasted landscape of craters and burned-out fortifications. The Kalos Reach, our new home, our grave. We disembarked into a forward operating base that had seen better centuries. The fortifications were scarred from repeated attacks, the walls patched with plascrete and prayer. Gun servitors tracked our movement with dead eyes, their targeting systems primed to fire on any collar that strayed beyond the perimeter. Guards in the livery of the Redemption Battalion watched us assemble, their expressions a mixture of contempt and pity. We were the new replacements. We were the fresh meat. We were the regiment that had betrayed the Emperor and earned our place in the killing ground. Brennan was not present for our arrival. He would be in the command center, reviewing intelligence reports, planning operations, receiving transmissions from sources whose identities were sealed and whose loyalties were uncertain. But his presence hung over the base like smoke, invisible and inescapable. I collected my equipment from the armory, a lasgun that had seen too many campaigns, a flak vest with repairs over repairs, a tactical visor with a cracked lens. Standard Penal Legion kit, good enough to fight with, not good enough to survive. The quartermaster who issued my gear barely looked at me, another face in the endless procession of the condemned. First deployment is tomorrow, he said. Sector 7 Alpha. Intelligence says insurgent activity, but intelligence is always wrong. Stay behind the regular units and try not to die too quickly. Sound advice. Useless advice. But I filed it away nonetheless. That night I found a corner of the barracks where I could think without being observed. The other soldiers from the 77th had dispersed throughout the battalion, integrated into squads and fire teams that did not know their history. Only a handful remained close enough to speak with, soldiers who had served in my platoon, who remembered the Mordecai Gap and Kalendros and the endless grind of campaign after campaign. One of them, a corporal named Jenna Marsh, had worked in the company headquarters before the arrests. She had processed paperwork, filed reports, logged equipment transfers. If anyone might remember the anomalies that Corrigan had hinted at, it would be her. I approached carefully. The walls had ears, and the explosive collars had sensors that could detect whispered conversations in certain frequencies. But there were ways to speak that the machines could not pass, old codes from the 77th, phrases that meant one thing on the surface, and another beneath. Weather is cold tonight, I said. Reminds me of Station Creche. Marsh looked up from her cot. She was a thin woman, angular, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Cold enough to freeze the water pipes, she replied. The response was correct, a recognition code from our days on the frozen station. I have been thinking about requisition forms, have you, 7th month, the transit station, documents that did not match their inventories. Marsh's eyes flickered toward the barracks door, then back to me. I remember. Vox unit parts signed out to maintenance, but maintenance never received them. I flagged it for review, but the review was closed before it started. By the Commissar's office, by Brennan. By the Commissar's office, she repeated carefully. I did not see the signature, but we both knew whose signature it had been. We both understood, now, how deep the rot went. He is going to send us into ambushes, I said. Every deployment will be compromised. Every mission will be a death sentence. Yes, we need evidence. Something that proves there is no evidence. Marsh cut me off, her voice barely audible. "There is nothing that can be proven, nothing that can be presented, nothing that anyone will believe. We are traitors. Our word is worthless. Even if we found Brennan standing over a Vox unit transmitting to the enemy, they would say we fabricated it. They would say we were covering for Hendricks. They would execute us on the spot. She was right. Of course she was right. The system that had condemned us would never reverse its judgment, never admit error, never acknowledge that its own mechanisms had been corrupted. We were beyond redemption in more than name. But I could not accept it. I could not stand in line for execution, knowing that the executioner was the true criminal. I could not march into ambushes designed by the man who had destroyed my regiment. I could not die without at least trying to expose what had been done. "Tomorrow's deployment," I said. "Sector 7 Alpha. Intelligence reports insurgent activity." "Intelligence is always wrong," Marsh echoed the quartermaster's words. "But what if it is right? What if there are insurgents in 7 Alpha, and what if they have been waiting for us? What if we could find out who told them we were coming?" Marsh studied me for a long moment, then slowly she nodded. "There is a signals intercept post at the edge of the sector, abandoned during the last insurgent offensive, but the equipment might still function. If Brennan is transmitting from the base, we might be able to capture the signal, find the frequency, prove the source." It was a thin hope, a desperate gamble, but it was something. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. I returned to my cot and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the barracks, soldiers coughing, praying, weeping in their sleep. Tomorrow we would march into enemy territory with a traitor's plans guiding our steps. Tomorrow we would try to find evidence that no one would believe, proof that no tribunal would accept, truth that the Imperium would rather bury than acknowledge. But we would try, because trying was all we had left. The morning sirens woke us before dawn. We assembled in the courtyard under grey skies thick with ash from distant fires, and Commissar Legate Brennan addressed us from his platform with words that meant nothing and promises that were lies. "Today you take another step toward redemption," he said. "Today you prove that the Emperor's mercy was not wasted on you. Today you fight." Then the transports loaded, and we were gone, racing towards Sector 7 Alpha and whatever waited there. The landscape of the Kalos Reach was a monument to destruction. Cratered fields stretched to every horizon, broken only by the skeletons of burned-out structures and the twisted remains of armored vehicles. Nothing grew here. Nothing lived that did not carry weapons. The air tasted of cordite and decay, and the sky never quite cleared of smoke. Our transport set down at a forward staging point 3 kilometers from the suspected insurgent positions. Regular army units had established a perimeter, proper soldiers with proper equipment who looked at us with the casual contempt reserved for penal fodder. We would be the first wave. We would draw fire, reveal positions, absorb casualties. Then the regulars would advance and claim whatever victory remained. I found Marsh in the chaos of deployment, her lasgun clutched tight, her eyes scanning the ruined landscape. "The signals post is northwest," she said, "beyond the engagement zone. If we can break contact during the assault, move through the dead ground. If we break contact, the collars detonate, not immediately. There is a delay while the system confirms you have left the operational perimeter. 60 seconds, maybe 90, enough time to reach the post, find the equipment, capture a signal. And then we die, probably, or we find something useful and die anyway, or we find nothing and die for nothing." She shrugged. "We were going to die regardless. At least this way it means something." The assault began 20 minutes later. Whistles blew, officers shouted, and the penal battalion surged forward across the broken ground. Immediately the enemy opened fire. They had known we were coming. Of course they had. The fire came from positions that should have been empty, from angles that should have been covered, from fortifications that intelligence said did not exist. Soldiers fell around me, screaming, burning, dying in the mud. The regular units held back, watching, waiting, as we were fed into the moor. I ran. Not toward the enemy, but northwest, toward the dead ground, toward the signals post that might hold answers. Marsh ran beside me, and for 60 heartbeats, 90 more, We expected the collars to pulse, to flash, to end everything in a burst of light and heat. They did not. Later, I would realize that Brennan's control over the collar system was not absolute, that the automated protocols could be circumvented, that operational zones could be redefined without triggering the safeguards. At the time, I simply ran, grateful for each second of continued existence. The signals post was a ruin, half collapsed into a crater, its equipment scattered across the floor. But Marsh knew what she was looking for. Her hands moved through the debris with practiced efficiency, connecting cables, rerouting power, coaxing dead systems back to life. There, she said. Active transmissions, military frequency, encrypted. I looked at the readout. The signal was strong, originating from within the forward operating base, from the command center, from Brennan. Can you capture it? Already capturing. Her fingers flew across the controls. He is transmitting coordinates, troop positions, fire zones. He is telling them exactly where to shoot. I watched the data scroll across the screen, encryption keys I could not read, coordinates I could not verify, but I could see the pattern. I could see how each transmission correlated with each casualty, how the flow of information matched the flow of blood. We have him, we have nothing. Marsh's voice was flat. Data captures can be forged, frequencies can be spoofed. Without physical evidence, without testimony, this is worthless. She was right. We had found truth, but truth was not proof. We had uncovered a conspiracy, but the conspiracy would bury us before we could expose it. The explosions were getting closer. The assault was collapsing, the penal battalions routed, the enemy advancing. In minutes, this position would be overrun. Marsh looked at me. Someone needs to survive, she said. Someone needs to take this somewhere it can make a difference. Where? To whom? The Imperium does not care, not the Imperium. She was typing rapidly now, transmitting the captured data somewhere beyond my comprehension. There are others who want Brennan stopped. Others who have been watching. I was contacted months ago before the arrests. Someone who knew what was coming. Someone who needed proof. You knew? All this time you knew? I suspected. I was not certain until now. She finished the transmission and stepped back. Go. West, past the crater field. There is a secondary extraction point outside the operational zone. The collars will not track you there. Someone will meet you. Someone who can use this. What about you? Marsh smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of someone who had already made their peace. I am going to stay here and make noise. Give you time. Make sure Brennan thinks the data died with me. She picked up her lasgun. It has been an honor, Sergeant. I wanted to argue, I wanted to refuse, but I knew she was right. Someone had to survive. Someone had to carry the truth beyond this killing ground. I ran west. Behind me, I heard Marsh's lasgun firing, heard her voice screaming defiance into the smoke and the chaos, heard the sounds of battle closing around the ruined signals post. I did not look back. The crater field was a maze of broken earth and poisoned water. I crawled through it, my collar silent, my breath ragged, my mind filled with the faces of the dead. Hendricks, whose treason had condemned us. Brennan, whose ambition had enabled it. Corrigan, Pierce, Vane, Teague, all the soldiers of the Veridon 77th who had died or would die because of one man's greed. And Marsh. Marsh, who had known, who had waited, who had sacrificed herself so that someone might survive. I reached the secondary extraction point as the sun was setting. It was nothing more than a collapsed bunker, half buried in rubble, invisible from any direction. I waited there, clutching my lasgun, expecting death. Instead, I found a woman in unmarked armor, her face hidden behind a tactical visor, her voice modulated to anonymity. Sergeant Dreyer, we have been waiting. For you. Who are you? Someone who wants Brennan stopped. Someone with the resources to act on the information you have provided. She held out a hand. Come with us. There is work to be done. I looked at her hand for a long moment. I did not know who she represented, what agenda she served, what price she would demand. But I knew that staying meant death. I knew that the Imperium would never vindicate us. I knew that the only path forward was the path that Marsh had bought with her life. I took her hand. and in the distance, beyond the smoke and the fire and the endless dying, I heard the vox horn of the Redemption Battalion, calling for soldiers who would never answer, calling for bodies to fill the next assault, calling for the condemned to march once more into the killing ground. Let them call. Let Brennan wait for reinforcements that would never come. Let the machine grind on without us. The Veridon 77th was dead, but someone had to remember what had killed us. Someone had to ensure that the truth, however buried, however denied, would one day find its way into the light. I climbed into the unmarked transport and did not look back.